The night of Christine's high school reunion felt like any other. A regular Wednesday evening. Work was stressful, the kids were in bed, and Christine was getting ready for a night out with old classmates she hadn't seen in years. I barely paid attention as she glided around the room, deciding between two dresses. I was caught up in a spreadsheet from work, and honestly, I assumed the reunion would be nothing more than nostalgia and some polite small talk. I remember the last thing she said before she left: "Don't wait up for me. I'll probably be late." She kissed me on the cheek, and I glanced up, giving her a quick smile. She looked stunning, though it didn't register with me at the time how much effort she had put into her appearance. A little more makeup than usual, that red dress I hadn't seen in a while, and the subtle excitement in her voice as she spoke about seeing some of her old friends. I didn't think much of it. She deserved a night out, some fun away from the monotony of life. If only I had known. The next morning, Christine seemed a little off, but I brushed it aside, figuring she was just tired from the late night. She didn't talk much about the reunion, just said it was nice, and that she had fun catching up with some of the old crowd. Her phone buzzed a few times as we sat over breakfast, and I noticed her checking it more than usual. But again, I didn't ask questions. I had no reason to. The text became a pattern over the next few weeks. We'd be sitting together watching TV, and her phone would vibrate on the coffee table. Christine would smile, glance at the message, and then put her phone back down without saying anything. I didn't want to be the overbearing husband asking, "Who's that?" every time her phone buzzed. I trusted her. Then she started mentioning this name. David. "I ran into David at the reunion," she said one evening while we were making dinner. "You remember me talking about him? We were really good friends in high school. He's funny. You'd like him." David. The name didn't mean much to me, but there was something in the way she said it. Something almost eager. I shrugged it off. After all, she had plenty of friends, some of whom I didn't know very well. Why would this one be any different? The first real crack in my blissful ignorance came a few weeks later. It was subtle, almost unnoticeable. We were in bed one night, both half asleep, when I noticed Christine's phone light up on her nightstand. It was well past midnight, and the message notification blinked brightly in the darkroom. I turned over, about to drift off, when I saw her reach for the phone. She hesitated for a second, glancing at me to see if I was awake, then quickly typed something and put the phone back down. "Who's messaging you this late?" I mumbled, my voice groggy. "Just one of the girls," she replied, her voice a little too casual. But the way she tensed slightly, the quickness of her response, it stuck with me. Over the next month, things changed subtly, but enough for me to notice. Christine started spending more time on her phone, texting late at night, laughing quietly at messages I wasn't privy to. She would excuse herself from the dinner table to take a quick call, her voice always a bit too animated when she spoke. One Saturday afternoon, while we were at the park with the kids, I overheard her on the phone. She was speaking in a hushed tone, turned slightly away from me. I caught a few words, just enough to make my stomach tighten. "No, he has no idea." "Yes, I know, but we can't just, not yet." When she hung up, she turned back to me, her face suddenly calm, her smile bright as if nothing had happened. "Everything okay?" I asked, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to sound casual. "Yeah, just planning something with some of the girls," she said without missing a beat. But I knew. In that moment, I knew something wasn't right. I started noticing the small things. The way she would angle her phone away from me when texting, the slight change in her laugh when she was on the phone late at night. The name, David, would pop up casually in conversations, but each time she mentioned him, it felt forced, like she was planting the idea of him being just a friend in my mind. The first time I looked at her phone while she was in the shower, I felt sick to my stomach. I had never been the jealous type, never the kind of husband to spy on my wife. But the doubt was gnawing at me, and I needed to know. I unlocked her phone. Her passcode hadn't changed. Scrolling through her messages, I found it. The conversation with David. It started innocently enough, old friends catching up after the reunion. But as I scrolled further, the tone shifted. The text became more flirtatious, more personal. "I've missed talking to you like this. Feels just like old times. You always made me laugh, Christine. I haven't smiled this much in years." And then, more recently, I can't stop thinking about you. My heart raced. The further I scrolled, the more painful it became. They had been texting almost daily for weeks. Late-night conversations, inside jokes, and hidden feelings I had no idea existed. But the worst part was the emotional intimacy, the kind that should have been reserved for us, her and me. I felt like a fool. I confronted her that evening. I couldn't hold it in any longer. Christine, who is David to you? She paused, startled by the directness of my question. I told you, Jack. He's just a friend from high school. Just a friend? You've been texting him constantly for weeks. I saw the messages, Christine. Her face went pale. For a moment, she didn't say anything. Then, she shook her head, a mix of frustration and guilt flashing in her eyes. Jack, it's not what you think. Then what is it? I demanded, my voice trembling. Because it sure as hell looks like you've been confiding in him, keeping things from me, talking to him about things you don't talk to me about. She sighed, sitting down at the kitchen table, her hands trembling slightly as she fidgeted with her wedding ring. It's complicated. We were really close in high school. After the reunion, we started talking again, and I guess I got caught up in it. It was nice to feel that connection again, but that's all it is, Jack. Just talking. Just talking. I echoed, my voice thick with disbelief. Christine, the things he said in those messages, they weren't just talking. She stood up suddenly, her voice rising. What do you want me to say, Jack? Yes, we've been talking. Yes, it got a little personal. But I swear, nothing physical has happened. I love you, and I would never cheat on you. The words hung in the air between us, but something felt hollow about them. I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust her. But the doubt had already taken root. I tried to move past it. We both did. For a few weeks, things settled down. Christine promised to limit her contact with David, and I tried to push the jealousy aside, convincing myself that it was just an emotional fling, a fantasy that would pass. But deep down, I knew the damage had been done. Then came the night that changed everything. It was a Friday, a few weeks after our confrontation. Christine had gone out for dinner with some of her girlfriends, or so she said. I had the kids at home, tucked into bed, and was cleaning up the kitchen when her phone buzzed on the counter. It was face up, unlocked, and a new message from David flashed across the screen. Can't wait to see you tonight. I'll pick you up at the usual spot. I felt my blood turn to ice. Tonight? Seeing him tonight? My hands shook as I grabbed her phone and scrolled through the recent messages. They had been planning this for days, meeting up secretly, going somewhere out of town where no one would recognize them. It wasn't just an emotional affair anymore. That night, I followed her. I waited until she left the house, her phone left carelessly on the counter as she hurried out, assuming I wouldn't be suspicious. I knew where she was going, thanks to the messages. I knew what I would find. I parked a block away from the usual spot and watched as David's car pulled up. Christine got in, smiling at him, her hand resting on his arm in a way that made my stomach churn. I followed them for miles, my heart pounding in my chest, a mixture of rage, betrayal, and devastation flooding through me. They stopped at a small, out-of-the-way hotel, the kind you only go to when you don't want to be seen. They disappeared inside together. I didn't confront them. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car for what felt like hours, my mind racing. My whole world had been upended in a matter of weeks. The woman I had loved, the mother of my children, had betrayed me in the worst possible way. And for what? A fling with a high school sweetheart? When I finally drove home, the weight of the betrayal settled over me like a heavy cloak. There was no going back now. The lies, the deceit, it was all too much. The next morning, when Christine came home, she acted as though nothing had happened. She kissed me on the cheek, told me she'd had a great time with her friends, and sat down for breakfast with the kids like it was any other day. But I knew everything. And soon, she would know that I knew. I didn't confront her that day. I wanted to, but I needed time to process, to figure out what to do next. My mind was a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, heartbreak, confusion. How could this have happened? How could she have done this to us, to our family? I spent the next few days gathering my thoughts, making plans. I wasn't going to let her off the hook easily. She needed to feel the full weight of her actions. When the moment finally came, it wasn't dramatic. There was no screaming, no throwing things. Just a quiet, devastating truth laid bare between us. We were sitting in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, the silence heavy with unspoken tension. I couldn't hold it in any longer. "I know, Christine," I said quietly, my voice steady. "I know about David. I know what you've been doing." Her face went pale, her eyes widening in shock. "Jack, don't," I interrupted, holding up a hand. "I followed you. I saw everything." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The guilt in her eyes was undeniable. "It's over," I said, my voice hollow. "Our marriage is over." In the weeks that followed, we went through the motions of separating, dividing assets, making arrangements for the kids. It was messy, painful, but there was no other option. The betrayal had cut too deep, and there was no going back. Christine tried to apologize, tried to explain, but it didn't matter anymore. The damage was done. David? He disappeared from her life just as quickly as he had re-entered it. The affair burned out, leaving nothing but ashes in its wake. As for me, I was left to pick up the pieces of a life I no longer recognized. The trust, the love, it had all been shattered. But as time passed, I began to rebuild, slowly but surely. Some betrayals leave scars that never fully heal. But they also teach you who you are and what you're willing to fight for. And in the end, I learned that some things, like trust, can never be fully regained once they've been broken. This story explores the slow unraveling of a marriage as a seemingly innocent reunion rekindles an old flame, escalating to a full-blown affair. It focuses on the husband's emotional turmoil, the subtle manipulations, and the devastating consequences of trust shattered by infidelity. The weeks after our separation were like living in a fog. I'd gone through the motions, packing up my things, signing the papers, and moving into a small apartment downtown. Christine kept the house. I didn't fight her on it. The thought of living in the place where our marriage had crumbled felt unbearable. But as much as I tried to move on, to focus on rebuilding my life, there was something nagging at me, something I couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just the betrayal, though that cut deep. It was the feeling that something still didn't add up. The pieces of the puzzle weren't fitting together. Why had Christine risked everything for David, only to have it burn out so quickly? I tried to push it from my mind, but that question haunted me. One evening, a few months after the separation, I ran into Christine by chance. It was late, and I had been walking home from a bar, drowning my sorrows in one too many beers. She was sitting in a coffee shop across the street from where I stood, her face lit up by the glow of her phone. But she wasn't alone. David was there, too. I froze. What the hell? I thought the affair was over. I had assumed she'd moved on, that whatever had burned between them had burned out. But there they were, huddled together at a small corner table, their faces close as they whispered to each other. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. She had lied again. I was about to turn away, to walk off and let it go, but something stopped me. This time, I wasn't going to sit back and watch her destroy everything without consequences. Instead of confronting her, I decided to follow them. For the next week, I became obsessed. I tracked Christine's movements, not in a creepy or invasive way. At least that's what I told myself, but I needed to know what was really going on. I watched as she met up with David again and again, sometimes late at night, other times during the day when she was supposed to be working. There was something more to this relationship, something I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just an affair. On a hunch, I decided to check something I had ignored during our marriage: our finances. Christine had always handled the bills, and I trusted her with it. But now, with her secret meetings and David back in the picture, I started to wonder. I logged into our old joint bank account and began combing through the transactions. That's when I found it. Large, unexplained withdrawals, thousands of dollars at a time, all taken out in cash over the past year. My heart sank. What the hell was Christine doing with that kind of money? And why hadn't I noticed? The next day, I confronted her. I wasn't subtle about it either. I showed up at the house, banging on the door until she answered. "What are you doing here, Jack?" she asked, her eyes wide with surprise. She looked rattled, almost as if she had been expecting me. "I want answers," I said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "What's going on with you and David?" She blinked, clearly caught off guard. "Jack, we've been over this. I told you it's—" "Don't lie to me," I snapped, cutting her off. "I saw you with him, and I know about the money." For a moment, her face drained of color. She took a step back, her hand trembling as she ran it through her hair. "Jack, it's not what you think." "Then explain it to me," I demanded, crossing my arms. "Because I've spent the last few days watching you sneak around with him, and I've seen the withdrawals. Thousands of dollars. Christine, what the hell are you doing?" She bit her lip, clearly struggling with what to say. "It's not about the money," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's complicated." "Complicated?" I repeated, incredulous. "Try me." She took a deep breath, then looked me straight in the eye. "David, he's in trouble. He's been in debt for years, and he came to me for help. I didn't want to tell you because I knew how you'd react." My mind reeled. "You're giving him our money? Are you serious, Christine? Why? Why would you do that for him?" "Because I owed him," she said softly. "From years ago, before we even got married." That's when the truth came out. Christine and David hadn't just been high school friends. They had been more than that, far more than she had ever let on. They had dated briefly after high school, and during that time, Christine had gotten herself into some financial trouble. David had bailed her out, paying off her debts and helping her start fresh. "I never told you because it was in the past," she continued, her voice shaky. "I thought I'd moved on. But when David showed up again, after all these years, he asked for my help. He was desperate, Jack, and I felt like I owed him." I stared at her, my mind spinning. This wasn't just about an affair. Christine had been hiding a massive part of her life from me for years, and now, because of that, we were both caught up in something far bigger than either of us had imagined. The more I pressed her, the more the details began to unravel. David wasn't just in debt. He was mixed up with some very dangerous people. He had gotten involved in gambling, racking up huge losses with some shady underground groups, and now they were after him for payment. And Christine? She had been funneling money to help him, hoping it would be enough to buy his way out. But it hadn't been. "They want more," she admitted, her voice trembling. "And I don't have it. I thought I could help him, but now I don't know what to do." I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Christine had put herself, and me, at risk, all because of some old debt she felt she owed a man who had been manipulating her for months, maybe even years. "Christine," I said, my voice deadly calm, "you need to go to the police." She shook her head, panic flashing in her eyes. "No, Jack, you don't understand. These people, they don't play by the rules. If we go to the police, they'll come after us. After the kids." That was when the gravity of the situation hit me. This wasn't just about money or infidelity anymore. This was about survival. I spent the next few days in a haze, trying to figure out what to do. Christine and I barely spoke, but we both knew we had to act fast. David had dragged us into something dangerous, and now it was only a matter of time before his debtors came knocking on our door. Then, one night, the phone rang. It was David. He sounded frantic, panicked, his voice shaking on the other end of the line. "Jack, I didn't mean for any of this to happen. They're after me, and they're coming for Christine next." "What do you mean, they're coming for Christine?" I demanded, my heart racing. I told them about her," he stammered, "that she was helping me with the money. They think she has more." My blood turned cold. Christine had been dragged into something that had spiraled out of control. I had to protect her, despite everything that had happened between us. She was still the mother of my children, and I couldn't let this ruin our lives. The next 48 hours were a blur of fear and chaos. Christine and I went to the police, but they told us there was little they could do without solid evidence. The money trail was too murky, and the people David was involved with were slippery, hard to pin down. That's when I realized there was only one way out. I had to meet with David's creditors myself. Through David, I arranged a meeting with the men he owed money to, shadowy figures who operated out of a nondescript building on the edge of town. I had no idea what I was walking into, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Christine's life, and my own, was on the line. When I arrived, the atmosphere was tense. The man in charge, a cold-eyed figure named Marcus, sat behind a desk, flanked by two intimidating bodyguards. "You're the husband?" Marcus asked, his voice dripping with amusement. "Didn't expect you to show up." I swallowed hard, my hands trembling. "I'm here to settle this. What do you want?" Marcus leaned back in his chair, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Simple. We want the money David owes us. And if you can't get that, well, you can guess the alternative." I stared at him, my mind racing. There was no way I could come up with the kind of money David owed. It was hundreds of thousands of dollars, far more than Christine had taken from our accounts. But then Marcus leaned forward, his smile fading. "Of course, there's another way we can settle this," he said quietly. "We know about Christine. We know she's been involved. How about this? You give us David, and we let her go." My stomach dropped. "What?" "Bring David to us," Marcus said coldly. "He's the one who owes us. You bring him, and we forget about Christine. She walks free." It was an impossible choice, betray David, or risk Christine's life. But after everything I had learned, after everything Christine had done to protect him, I realized something. David wasn't worth saving. He had used Christine, manipulated her guilt, and dragged us into a nightmare. He wasn't a victim. He was the cause of all of this. So, I made the decision. I won't go into the details of what happened next, but let's just say that when David was handed over to Marcus, it was clear he wouldn't be coming back. Christine never found out what I had done. She didn't need to know. In the end, we were free. Free from David's hold. Free from the dangerous men who had been circling our lives. But the cost had been high. Too high. Christine and I never reconciled. The betrayal, the lies, the danger. It was too much to recover from. But at least now, I could move on, knowing that the worst was behind me. Or so I thought. 6 months later, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. No return address, no signature. Inside, there was only a single line, scrawled hastily on a piece of paper. "You can't run forever." The moment I saw those words, "You can't run forever," my blood went cold. I stood there, holding the letter, feeling the weight of something dark and unfinished crashing back into my life. I had thought it was over. After everything that had happened with Christine and David, I had finally begun to rebuild my life. I had started to feel normal again. But this letter, this ominous message, sent chills down my spine. I read it over and over, trying to figure out who had sent it. Marcus? One of his men? Had something gone wrong when David was handed over? My mind raced with questions, but no answers came. The letter was a clear reminder that the nightmare wasn't fully behind me. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching, waiting for me to make a wrong move. Over the next few days, paranoia settled into my bones. Every shadow seemed darker, every stranger's gaze felt suspicious. I started checking over my shoulder wherever I went, looking for signs that someone was following me. The letter had shaken me to my core, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't convince myself that it was just a scare tactic. The fear gnawed at me, day and night. I started getting headaches, losing sleep, and even considered contacting Christine. Maybe she had received a similar letter, but we hadn't spoken since we finalized the divorce. I wasn't even sure if she was still in town. But one night, when the paranoia became too much, I made the call. Christine answered after a few rings, her voice wary. "Jack?" "Yeah, it's me," I replied, my voice tight. "Look, I don't want to stir up old stuff, but have you gotten any strange letters lately?" She hesitated for a moment. "No. Why? What's going on?" I didn't know how to explain it. How could I tell her that everything I had done to protect her, everything I thought had resolved the situation, had somehow circled back to haunt me? "I got a letter," I said finally. It didn't say much, just, "You can't run forever." No signature, no return address. Christine's breath hitched. "Do you think it's from them? From Marcus?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out," I admitted. "I thought after what happened with David, it was over. I thought we were safe." "Maybe it's just a scare tactic," she suggested, but I could hear the fear in her voice too. She wasn't convinced. Maybe, I echoed, though I didn't believe it. Just keep an eye out, okay? If you get anything weird, call me. I will, she promised. After that call, I was left with an unsettling feeling that grew stronger every day. Nothing happened for a while. No more letters, no strange encounters. But the sense of dread lingered like a dark cloud over my life. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was waiting for me to let my guard down. Then, one night, I heard a noise outside my apartment. It was late, close to midnight, and I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard what sounded like footsteps outside my door. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened closely. There it was again, a soft, deliberate creak of someone moving just outside. I slipped out of bed quietly, grabbing the baseball bat I kept in the closet for protection, and crept toward the door. My pulse raced as I reached the peephole, half expecting to see nothing but an empty hallway. But when I looked through, I saw a figure. A man, dressed in dark clothes, stood just outside my door, his face obscured by the hood of his jacket. He wasn't moving, wasn't knocking, just standing there, waiting. I felt a surge of panic rise in my throat. My mind screamed at me to call the police, but instead, I stood frozen, my hand gripping the bat tightly. I wasn't sure if he knew I was there, if he could hear me on the other side of the door. Then, slowly, almost as if he knew I was watching, the man slipped something under the door. I stared at it, a plain white envelope, just like the first letter. My hand shook as I unlocked the door, yanking it open, but by the time I stepped into the hallway, the man was gone. I looked around, but the hallway was empty. Not a sound, not a trace of him left behind. I brought the envelope inside, my hands trembling as I ripped it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, with a message scrawled in the same handwriting as before. "We haven't forgotten." My heart pounded as I read the words, and the realization hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just about David anymore. It was about me. They weren't done with me. Marcus, his men, whoever was behind this, they still wanted something. The weight of what I had done started to sink in. I had given David up to save Christine and myself, but in doing so, I had left loose ends. And now, those loose ends were coming back to haunt me. I didn't know what to do. The police couldn't protect me from people like this. They'd made that clear the first time. And if I ran, they'd find me. They had found me once already. The only option was to face it head-on. A few days later, I received a phone call. This time, it wasn't a cryptic letter or a hooded figure at my door. It was Marcus himself. His voice was cold, calculating, as if we were discussing a business transaction instead of my life. "You thought you could settle this by giving us David," he said calmly, "but you still owe us." "I don't owe you anything," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "David's debt isn't paid," Marcus continued, "and now it's yours." My blood ran cold. "What do you want from me?" "Simple," he said, as if it were obvious. "I want what you took from us." "I don't have the money," I said quickly, panic rising in my chest. "I don't have anything to give you." There was a long pause, and then Marcus's voice dropped lower, more menacing. "Then we'll take something else." The call ended, and I was left standing in my apartment, my heart racing. I didn't know what Marcus meant by something else, but I knew one thing: this wasn't over. I had thought the nightmare had ended with David's disappearance, with handing him over to Marcus. But it wasn't that simple. I had become a part of something far darker, something I couldn't escape. For the next few days, I lived in a state of constant fear. Every knock on the door, every shadow passing by my window sent me into a panic. I didn't know when or how they would come for me, but I knew it was only a matter of time. Then, one evening, I returned to my apartment to find the door slightly ajar. My heart dropped into my stomach. I hadn't left it open. I stepped inside cautiously, my mind racing. Everything looked the same, until I reached the bedroom. On the bed, neatly laid out, were photos. Photos of me. Photos of Christine. Photos of our kids. And underneath them, a single note: "We always collect." I realized then that there was no escape. Marcus and his men had made their point. They could get to me whenever they wanted. They knew where I lived, where Christine lived, where our kids went to school. They were sending a message. They own me now. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I kept replaying everything in my mind, trying to figure out how I had gotten to this point, how I had allowed myself to become entangled in something so dangerous. But there was no going back. In the days that followed, I took every precaution I could. Changed my locks, installed cameras, even contacted the police again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't enough. Marcus had resources, and he wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. The final blow came 2 weeks later. I arrived home from work to find another envelope waiting for me. This time, inside was a photo of Christine, taken from a distance as she walked down the street with our children. On the back of the photo were 2 words: last warning. That was it. The nightmare I thought I had escaped was alive and closing in on me from every angle. The men who had taken David were not done with me, not by a long shot. Marcus had made sure I understood what was at stake. There was no more running, no more hiding. Now, it was only a matter of survival. After seeing the photo of Christine and the kids with the chilling message scrawled on the back, last warning, I felt my world closing in. The walls of my apartment seemed to press in on me, suffocating as the grim reality settled in. They weren't just coming for me. They were coming for her. For my kids. I stared at the photo, my hands shaking, my mind racing. Marcus had been clear. If I didn't find a way to repay David's debt, everything I cared about was at risk. But where was I going to come up with hundreds of thousands of dollars? I was barely holding it together after the divorce, struggling to pay rent on a modest apartment. I couldn't run. They would find me. And if I stayed, they would take everything from me, piece by piece. The next morning, I packed a bag. I didn't know what my plan was exactly, but I knew I had to leave. Get out of the city, go somewhere I couldn't be tracked. But first, I had to see Christine. I had to warn her. I arrived at her house, feeling the weight of guilt heavy on my chest. After everything we had been through, the affair, the lies, the money, this wasn't how I wanted to come back into her life. But I had no choice. Christine answered the door, looking surprised to see me. It had been months since we'd spoken, since the divorce had been finalized. "Jack, what are you doing here?" she asked, her brow furrowed with confusion. "I need to talk to you," I said, my voice low, urgent. "It's about Marcus, about David's debt. They're coming for us, Christine. They sent me a message." Her face paled instantly, and I could see the fear in her eyes. "What do you mean?" I thought it was over." "I did too," I admitted, stepping inside. "But it's not. They sent me a photo of you and the kids. They know where you are. They know everything. They're not done with us." Christine's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with terror. "Oh my God, what are we going to do?" "I don't know," I said, feeling the weight of helplessness press down on me. "But I can't just sit here and wait for them to come. We need to disappear, at least for a while. I need to figure out how to make this go away." She nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "Where can we go? What about the kids?" "We'll figure something out," I said, though I had no plan. "But we can't stay here. It's not safe." We packed quickly, throwing together bags for the kids, trying to remain calm even as panic simmered just below the surface. I could see Christine's hands shaking as she zipped up the suitcases, her mind racing with the same questions as mine. Where could we go? How long would we be safe? Would we ever be able to return to normal? That night, we left town under the cover of darkness. We drove without a destination, the kids fast asleep in the back seat, blissfully unaware of the danger surrounding us. I couldn't stop thinking about the look on Marcus's face the day I handed over David, the cold, calculating way he had spoken about debts and payments, as if human lives were just part of a ledger he was balancing. We drove for hours, heading further into the countryside, away from the city. I had no idea where we were going, but I knew we needed distance, somewhere remote, where Marcus's men wouldn't think to look. Christine was quiet for most of the drive, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. But every now and then, I would catch her looking at me out of the corner of her eye, a mix of fear and something else, something like regret. "Jack," she said softly after a long silence, "I'm so sorry. For everything. For David. For all of it. I never thought it would come to this." I didn't respond right away. What was there to say? Her affair with David had set this nightmare in motion, but blaming her now wouldn't fix anything. The only thing that mattered was keeping her and the kids safe. I know, I said finally, my voice quiet, but we don't have time to look back. We just need to figure out how to survive this. We ended up in a small, forgotten town, the kind of place where no one asks questions and strangers don't stand out. It wasn't much, but it was safe, for now. We found a cheap motel on the outskirts of town, paid in cash, and hunkered down, trying to keep the kids entertained with TV and snacks while Christine and I figured out our next move. The first few days were tense, every knock on the door sending my heart racing, every unfamiliar car passing by making me freeze. But nothing happened. No one came. No more letters, no more threats. For a brief moment, it felt like maybe we had outrun the danger. But I knew better than to relax. On the fourth day, I received a call from an unknown number. My heart sank as I stared at the phone, my hand shaking as I answered. Hello? Jack? The voice on the other end was familiar, cold. Marcus. I swallowed hard, my pulse racing. What do you want? You thought you could run from me? He asked, a hint of amusement in his voice. You really think I wouldn't find you? I glanced around the motel room, my blood running cold. Had they found us already? Were they outside, watching? You'll never get away from this, Jack. David's debt still stands, and now, it's yours. You either pay what's owed, or I'll take something much more valuable. My grip tightened on the phone. I don't have that kind of money. You know I don't. Then you'll have to figure something out, Marcus said darkly. You have 48 hours. After that, well, let's just say I don't need to remind you what happens next. The line went dead, and I stood there, staring at the phone in my hand, feeling a cold sweat break out across my skin. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was Christine, the kids, everyone I cared about. I had 48 hours to come up with an impossible sum of money. I knew what I had to do. It was the last thing I wanted to consider, but I had no other choice. I had been running through every option in my mind for days, selling everything I owned, borrowing from every friend or family member I could, but it wouldn't be enough. The only person who could help me now was the last person I wanted to involve. I called Darren. Darren had warned me the first time, months ago, that Marcus and his men didn't play by the rules. He'd seen it all before, working on the edges of these criminal circles, and he had told me in no uncertain terms that once you were in, you never really got out. But Darren also had connections. The kind of connections that might be able to make this go away, if I was willing to pay the price. When I explained the situation, Darren was quiet for a long time. Jack, he finally said, his voice low. You've got yourself into a real mess, but I'll help you. I'll make some calls. But if you do this, there's no turning back. You'll owe some people, and they'll collect when the time comes. I knew what he meant. I wasn't just buying my way out of this. I was trading one debt for another. But if it meant keeping Christine and the kids safe, I didn't have a choice. Do it, I said, my voice shaking with fear and resolve. Just do it. The next 48 hours were a blur of anxiety and fear. Darren worked fast, pulling strings with people I didn't want to know existed. Marcus's debt was handled, at least, that's what I was told. Darren wouldn't give me details, and I didn't ask. All I knew was that the immediate danger had passed. But the cost, I could feel it hanging over me, like a shadow I couldn't escape. Darren had made sure I knew the deal. One day, the people who had helped me would come calling. And when they did, I would have to pay in whatever way they saw fit. I had bought us time. I had kept my family safe, for now. A week after we returned home, I found another letter in my mailbox. My heart sank as I pulled it out, half expecting it to be another threat. But when I opened it, I saw just a single sentence. You still owe us. I knew then that the nightmare wasn't truly over. I had escaped Marcus, but I had traded one set of chains for another. One day, they would come for me, and when they did, I'd be ready. Or at least, I hoped I would be. And that's how it ended. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe, like, and comment your thoughts below.